For 5 years, every September, Camille Marchetti had signed that paper without ever reading a word of it. This year she read it, and on page 3, she found something that made her set the pen down and say 4 words. "I'm not signing today." By noon, she was down on her knees on the wet brick outside the restaurant, in the middle of the Sunday lunch rush on Federal Hill, an empty pitcher still dripping over her head, and half of Providence watching from the sidewalk. 5 years I fed you. 5 years I gave you a bed. And now you think you get to tell me no? Camille didn't cry. She didn't beg. She lifted her face, looked straight up at the woman standing on the step, and said nothing at all. Then a car door opened across the street. The man who got out was somewhere in his 30s. Dark hair going gray early at the temples, an old scar across the knuckles of his right hand, and he crossed the road without hurrying, the way men who've never once had to hurry cross a road. He laid his coat over her shoulders. He didn't help her up. He didn't ask if she was all right. He looked up at the sign above the door for a long moment, and then he was gone. Nobody on that street knew who he was, and nobody knew he'd been parked there since 8 that morning, waiting. If a story like this moves you, do us a favor and hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come join us. There's a lot more coming. Now let's go back to that Sunday morning, 3 hours before the water, and find out what that man was really doing on Atwell's Avenue. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the downstairs kitchen was lit by only a single lamp hanging over the work table, and the sharp scent of yeast was rising from the bowl of dough resting beneath a cloth. Camille had been there since before the street outside made a sound. She pulled the dough onto the wooden surface, pressed down with the heel of her hand, folded it, turned it a quarter turn, then pressed again. Her left hand was stiffer than her right. The old scar across the back of it didn't hurt. It simply refused to straighten all the way when the weather turned cold. And September mornings in Providence were always cold. She adjusted her grip, shifted more of the work to her right wrist, and kept going. That was something she had learned during her first winter. In the corner of the kitchen, Ottilie Nunez stood at the sink with both hands submerged in water, arranging each plate on the rack in an order only she understood. She didn't say anything. She never said anything at this hour, but every now and then she lifted her eyes toward the work table, watched the young woman's hands moving over the dough, then looked down again. Camille divided the dough into equal portions without needing a scale. She rolled each piece into a smooth ball between her palms, placed it on a tray, then covered it with a damp cloth. Beyond the small high window, the sky was still completely dark. She had just finished the third tray when she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy and unhurried, and she knew who it was before he reached the last step. Brantley Prescott stood at the foot of the staircase, with one hand still resting on the railing, as though he had no intention of fully entering the kitchen. "My mother is waiting for you in the office," he said. Camille didn't look up. She finished laying the cloth over the last tray and adjusted it until all 4 corners fell evenly. "You heard me, didn't you?" "I heard you." He remained there a little longer, waiting for something she had no intention of giving him, then turned and went back upstairs. Camille wiped her hands on her apron. Ottilie still hadn't turned around, but the water in the sink had stopped moving. Camille went up the stairs. The office sat above the kitchen, a narrow room with a window overlooking the roof of the neighboring building, and Delia Prescott was already seated behind the desk with a cup of untouched tea in front of her. She was dressed as though important guests were expected, even though the restaurant wouldn't open for several more hours. "Sit down, sweetheart," she said, and her voice was as gentle as it was every September. It was the voice she used when receiving the women from the neighborhood council, the voice of a woman who had never needed to raise it to anyone in her life. Camille sat in the chair across from her. On the desk was a stack of papers already clipped together, with a pen lying horizontally across the top, its point facing her. Delia pushed the papers across the desk with the tips of 2 fingers. "Same as every year," she said. "Sign the last page for me." Camille picked up the pen. She had made this motion in this room so many times that her hand knew the path before she did. Turn to the last page, place the pen on the line, sign, push the papers back, stand up, go downstairs. The whole thing had never taken even a minute. But that morning, her hand stopped on the first page. She wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because the smell of yeast from downstairs was still clinging to her skin, because it was still dark outside, because she had lain awake for a long time the night before without sleeping. She turned the first page, then the second. Across the desk, the tea remained untouched, and Delia said nothing. Camille turned to the third page. There, tucked inside a long paragraph about interest rates and the good faith of the parties, was a line she had to read twice before she understood that she was reading it correctly. The signing party agrees to waive all present and future claims to the property located at 219 Atwells Avenue. She looked up. What is this? Delia didn't look down at the paper. She looked directly at Camille. And for one very brief moment, only long enough for someone paying close attention to notice, something in her face stopped. Which part? Page 3. There's a building listed here. Camille placed her finger on the line and left it there. I owe you for room and board. I understand that, but I've never owned any property. Why would a room and board debt agreement mention a building? The question was so simple that it didn't sound like an accusation. It was only a question. Delia didn't answer. She didn't explain, didn't wave it away, didn't say it was standard legal language. She pushed her chair back, stood, walked around the desk, went out through the door, and left it open behind her. Camille remained alone in the narrow room, with the pen still in her hand and the papers lying open to page 3. In 5 years inside that building, she had heard that woman answer many questions far harder than this one. This was the first time she hadn't answered at all, and it was that silence, not the line written on the page, that sent a chill down Camille's spine. By noon, as the Sunday lunch rush reached its peak, that heavy silence erupted into open fury. Delia dragged Camille out onto the wet brick steps in front of half of Providence, poured a pitcher of ice water over her head, and screamed her accusations. A quiet stranger stepped from a car across the street, laid his coat over Camille's shoulders without a word, and disappeared into the crowd. When the street finally settled, Camille walked back upstairs. The small room on the 3rd floor had one window facing the brick wall of the building next door, and Camille had to turn sideways just to change clothes in the narrow space between the single bed and the wall. Her shirt was soaked from her shoulders down to her waist, her hair was still plastered against her neck, and the ice water had long since dried away, but the cold was still lodged deep inside her body. She took off the wet clothes, draped them over the back of the chair, and pulled another set from the drawer. She moved slowly, one motion at a time, as though if she moved slowly enough, what had happened that afternoon might somehow rearrange itself into something she could understand. Outside, the street had returned to its usual Sunday rhythm. People walked past the restaurant as they did every week. What had happened on the sidewalk had settled in the way things in Federal Hill always settled, which meant no one talked about it anymore, but everyone remembered. Camille sat down on the edge of the bed and thought about the thing she had avoided thinking about all afternoon. She could leave. The door downstairs wasn't locked. It never had been. No one guarded the stairs. No one counted the hours she came and went. She was 27 years old. She knew how to bake, and there were no fewer than 10 kitchens in this city that would gladly take someone who knew how to knead dough before dawn. She could stand up, walk downstairs, step through the door, and never come back. But she didn't stand up. The first reason was the safe in the office. Her birth certificate was inside it, her driver's license, her social security card, even the bank card she had opened back when she was still in school. Delia had put them there during Camille's first week and said, in the voice of someone doing her a favor, that young women living alone were always losing important papers, so she would keep them safe for her. Camille had nodded. Back then, she nodded at everything. Without those documents, she couldn't get a decent job anywhere, couldn't rent a room, couldn't open an account. She would walk out that door with nothing but the clothes on her back, and nothing to prove who she was. The second reason was the agreement. She had signed it with her own hand. That was the part she couldn't deny. She had signed it 3 days after her mother's funeral, in the narrow upstairs room, when she still couldn't remember what day of the week it was and hadn't slept properly for a single night. Delia placed the papers in front of her, handed her the pen, and Camille signed. She didn't read them. She didn't ask where the amount written there had come from, who had calculated it, or how. Her handwriting on the signature line had trembled so badly that later, every time she looked at it, it seemed strange to her, like the handwriting of another person. But it was hers. The third reason was the file Delia had never once to us mentioned directly. It only appeared in unfinished remarks, dropped into conversation at moments that seemed almost accidental. Last month, there was money missing from the safe. Luckily, no one made a serious issue of it. You know how people think kitchen staff are harmless, but the police see things differently. She would say things like that while rearranging a stack of napkins or staring out the window, never while looking directly at Camille. Then she would immediately change the subject. Over 5 years, that sentence had been repeated often enough for Camille to understand that somewhere in this building there was a file already prepared, waiting only for someone to decide to bring it out. And the fourth reason. The fourth didn't need a lock, didn't need a safe, didn't need a single threat. During the last 2 years of her mother's life, she spent more time in the hospital than at home. There were stretches that lasted weeks, transfers in the middle of the night. Bills so thick, Camille was afraid to open the envelopes. She was 22 years old, and halfway through her final semester. She dropped out. She worked 2 shifts, and the amount of money was still more than she could ever reach. Delia had taken care of all of it. She had said so only once, right after the funeral, in a voice as light as if she were talking about the weather, telling Camille not to worry about it anymore, that she had handled everything, that her mother had been her friend. Then she never mentioned it again. She didn't need to. Camille sat on the edge of the bed in that narrow 3rd-floor room, her hair still damp, and she understood one thing very clearly, something the people standing on the sidewalk that afternoon probably hadn't understood. She wasn't staying because she was afraid of that woman. She was staying because somewhere deep inside herself, she believed she owed Delia a debt she could never repay in an entire lifetime. And a person who believes they owe a debt doesn't need anyone to lock the door. By late afternoon, the building had returned to exactly what it was every other day, and no one inside mentioned what had happened at noon again. The restaurant opened at 5 o'clock, and an hour before that, the small dining room in the back had already been arranged the way Delia liked it. The long table pulled into the center, the tablecloth smoothed flat to every corner, the teapot waiting on a silver tray. The women from the neighborhood council arrived one after another. One barely seated before the next came through the door, and Delia greeted each of them as though she had been standing there all afternoon waiting. There were 4 of them altogether, all around her age, all carrying the easy familiarity of people who had sat in that room many times before. Camille brought the tray out from the kitchen, a second pot of tea, a plate of small pastries, several spoons. She set them down at the edge of the table, stepped back, and no one at the table looked up at her. It wasn't rudeness, it was simply habit. In that room, she was part of the way the tea remained full, just as the tray was part of the way the tea was carried in. The woman sitting closest to the door began by complimenting the outfit Delia was wearing, then moved on to the neighborhood's year-end award, and from there everything followed the path it always did. "It's you this year," she said. "There's no debate about it. Everyone in this neighborhood knows what you've done." Delia set down her cup. She didn't object immediately. She let the praise rest there for one beat, long enough for it to settle over the whole table. Then she shook her head. "You're giving me too much credit. I haven't done anything." "Haven't done anything?" Another woman leaned forward. "What about the girl downstairs? Have you forgotten her?" Camille was collecting the small plates from the far end of the table. She was 3 steps away from them. She didn't stop moving. "That's different," Delia said, and her voice lowered slightly, the tone people use when they're about to tell a sad story they would rather not have to tell. "Her mother and I were very close years ago. Then her mother passed away. The girl was left all alone, 22 years old, no profession, no home, no one in this world. If I hadn't brought her here, where would she have gone?" The entire table fell silent in that particular way people do when they hear a story they've heard before and still find it moving. "Not everyone would do what you did," the woman nearest the door said. "It's easy to talk, but taking someone into your own home for 5 years, feeding her, housing her, paying for medicine, teaching her a trade on top of it, how many people would do that?" "I never thought about whether I could bear it or not," Delia said. "At the time, I only thought that if it had been her mother, she would have done the same for my child." Camille passed behind Delia's chair with a stack of plates in her hands. She heard every word. She even heard the brief pause Delia left after the final sentence. The pause meant to give the listener time to feel something. Camille didn't stop. She walked straight through the kitchen door, set the stack of plates beside the sink, and Ottilie Nunez stood there with both hands in the water, without turning around. In the dining room, one of the women said the neighborhood needed more people like Delia, and the others agreed immediately. Then the conversation moved on to something else. The streetlight at the corner that had been broken since the previous month and still hadn't been repaired. Camille washed her hands beneath the faucet, dried them on her apron, then carried a 3rd pot of tea out from the kitchen. She refilled every cup, moving clockwise around the table as she always did, and not one of the 4 women looked up. The story they had just finished telling was about her. She was standing right in the middle of it, and there was no place anywhere in that story that required her to exist. 6 days later, on Saturday afternoon, a phone call came into the restaurant, and after that call, the rhythm of the entire building changed. Camille was sliding trays of pastries into the oven when she heard Brantley running down the stairs, not descending the way he normally did, but actually running, and he told someone in the kitchen that the private room had to be cleared, reset with 1 table, only 1 table, and no additional guests were to be seated there that evening. Someone asked whether he meant the entire room for a single table. Brantley didn't answer. He turned and went back upstairs. By 4 o'clock, Delia came down to the kitchen, something she almost never did during preparation hours, and she walked through the room examining everything as though she were searching for a mistake. She said to replace the tablecloth with the new set. She said to take out the glassware from the locked cabinet, the set that was always kept secured. She stood in the doorway of the private room for a long time, looking inside, then said to move the table a little farther to the left, away from the window. No one asked why. There was a kind of silence in the kitchen Camille had never heard there before. Not the silence of people being busy, but the silence of people who all knew something and had all decided not to say it aloud. When the assignments were handed out, Delia looked around once and pointed at Camille. This girl will serve the private room. The head waiter was standing there already dressed for service, and he opened his mouth as if he were about to say something. Delia didn't let him. She doesn't talk much. That's what we need tonight. The guest arrived at 7 o'clock. Camille didn't see him enter because she was in the kitchen, but she knew he had arrived because the conversation in the main dining room dipped for a moment before returning to normal. When she carried the tray out, Brantley was standing at the doorway of the private room with both arms hanging at his sides, and there was an empty chair beside the table that he made no move to sit in. He didn't step into the room either. He simply remained at the threshold, like someone who had been called to the front of a classroom and hadn't yet been given permission to return to his seat. Then Delia walked past him, and she went straight into the private room. Camille stopped outside the door for 1 second because of that. In 5 years inside this building, she had never once seen Delia Prescott personally go out to greet a guest. Delia received people in her own private dining room, accepted compliments, poured tea for the neighborhood council, but she didn't go to anyone else's table. Tonight she did. She stood beside the table, with both hands folded in front of her, and said something Camille couldn't quite hear, her voice slightly higher than usual. The man seated at the table answered with a very short sentence. Delia nodded, thanked him, then walked out. She came out faster than she had gone in. Camille carried in the water. She poured it, stepped back, and took her place against the wall. He didn't look up. She brought out the first course, set it down, cleared the old plate, brought the next one. He still didn't look up. He ate slowly, ate very little, and spent most of the time staring at the blank wall in front of him. Twice his phone vibrated on the table. Both times he turned it face down without looking at it. Near the end of the meal, Delia ordered dessert according to her own preference. But by then, the only thing left in the kitchen was a tray of pastries that had just come out of the oven, the kind Camille had made that morning from her mother's recipe, the kind she still baked in a small batch every week for the kitchen even though no one ever called it by name. She cut a portion, placed it on a plate, and carried it out. She set the plate in front of him. He was reaching for his water glass. His hand stopped midway. He didn't look at the plate. He didn't look at her either. He sat motionless long enough for Camille to wonder whether she had brought him the wrong thing. Then he set his napkin on the table, stood up, and walked out. He didn't say a single word to her. In the main room, Brantley followed him for 2 steps, then stopped halfway because he seemed not to know what he intended to do. Delia came out from the back, looked at the door that had just closed, then looked into the private room, where the plate remained untouched beside the hastily folded napkin. She didn't ask anyone a question. Camille stood against the wall, still holding the empty tray, and looked at that plate longer than necessary. She didn't understand any of it, but for the first time in that building, she had watched someone walk away without anyone daring to ask why. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when the only sounds left in the kitchen were the hum of the refrigerator and the quiet presence of several pots turned upside down on the rack, Camille dragged 2 garbage bags toward the back door and pushed it open with her shoulder. The alley was narrow and wet, with a single light mounted on the wall of the building across from them, casting a dull yellow glow over the pavement. She had taken 3 steps when she saw him. He was leaning against a car parked across the mouth of the alley, both hands in his pockets, and how long he had been standing there, she had no idea. Camille stopped. She didn't put the garbage bags down. In this neighborhood, no one needed to point at a man and say his name for people to know who he was. They knew by the way everyone else fell silent when he walked into a room, and the previous Saturday night, she had seen enough. "You work too late," he spoke first. His voice wasn't loud, and in an alley this narrow, it didn't need to be. Camille set the 2 garbage bags down beside the wall. "I close the kitchen." "Every night?" "Yes." She wiped her hands on her apron, then stopped, because her hands weren't wet at all. She was only looking for something to do with them. He didn't come any closer. He didn't leave where he was either. "That plate of pastry the other night," he said. "You made it, didn't you?" Camille looked at him. She didn't know the right way to answer, and she had learned a long time ago that when she didn't know how to answer, the safest thing was to tell the truth as briefly as possible. "Yes." "Where did the recipe come from?" "My mother taught me." He was silent for a very long time after that, long enough for Camille to hear water dripping from some drain pipe above them. "What was your mother's name?" She hesitated, not because she was afraid to say it, but because in 5 years inside that building, no one had ever asked her that question. "Rosalie," she said. He pulled one hand from his pocket, then let it fall to his side. He looked past her shoulder, toward the back door still standing slightly open, toward the concrete step beneath her feet with one corner chipped away, and he stared at it so long that Camille turned to look too, even though there was nothing there. "When I was a boy, I lived with my uncle on this street," he said, "a few blocks from here. Every night I used to walk down and sit on that step." Camille said nothing. Back then, this building was a bakery. Around 9 o'clock at night, the back door would open, and the light from the kitchen would spill gold across this whole alley. There was a young woman working inside. She would leave a warm loaf of bread and a glass of milk on the step, wrapped in a cloth. He paused, then she'd managed how school had gone that day. A car passed at the end of the alley, its headlights sweeping across the wall before disappearing. I'd tell her about some boy in my class getting punished. She'd laugh. The next day I'd come back, and she'd ask me again. It went on like that for 2 years. He looked down at the step once more. My uncle had bread too. It was just that no one ever asked me that question. Camille stood motionless in the alley. She could hear the beat of her own heart inside her ears. Then one day the door didn't open anymore, he said. I came back for several more nights. The kitchen light stayed dark. I didn't know her name. I never asked. He pushed himself upright from the car. Children don't think to ask people's names. They just assume the door will open again tomorrow. Camille opened her mouth to ask something, though she wasn't even sure what. But he had already stepped past her, and as he came alongside her, he stopped for half a step. His eyes settled on the neckline of her shirt, where the chain around her neck had slipped free when she bent down to set the garbage bags on the ground. He didn't reach for it. He didn't ask to see it. He only looked, and nothing in his face changed, but something in the way he stood suddenly went rigid. "Don't sell that," he said, "even if you're starving." Camille raised a hand to her throat. She had heard those words before. She had heard them in a hospital room, from the mouth of a woman who had only enough breath left to speak a few words at a time, on the night before the final night. She remembered even the way her mother's hands had trembled while fastening the clasp behind Camille's neck. No one else in the world knew those words. "What did you just say?" she asked, but he had already reached the end of the alley. The car door closed very softly, and the car disappeared before she managed to take even one step. Camille remained alone in the wet alley with 2 garbage bags at her feet, one hand still gripping the chain at her throat, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt as though something very old had just stirred awake inside that building. The following afternoon, in the middle of her shift, Camille went into the storeroom to get flour, and Ottilie Nunez followed her inside and closed the door behind them. She had never closed that door before. "Let me see your necklace." Camille straightened, still holding the sack of flour in her arms. "What?" "Let me see it." She set the flour down and pulled the chain out from beneath her collar. Ottilie didn't touch it. She only leaned closer, narrowed her eyes at the back of the copper locket, and stared so long that Camille finally had to ask, "What do you see?" "This mark." Ottilie's finger stopped just short of the metal. "A bundle of wheat inside a circle. It's almost completely worn away. I don't need to see it clearly." She stepped back half a pace. "Go out through the front door, walk back onto the sidewalk, and look up. The stone beam above the entrance has that exact symbol carved into it. It's been there since 1968. Camille said nothing. "This building used to be a bakery," Ottilie said. "What bakery?" "Marchetti." Camille released the chain. It fell against the front of her shirt. "Say that again." "You heard me. Marchetti was my mother's last name." "I know. How long have you known?" "Since the day you walked into this kitchen." Camille leaned back against the shelving unit, and she could feel the hard wood against her back more clearly than anything else in the room. "Who built the bakery?" "Ilario Marchetti." "Who was he?" "Your grandfather." A pot clattered against another one in the kitchen outside. Neither of them turned toward the sound. "He stamped that mark onto every loaf of bread," Ottilie said. "His whole life. People could pick up a loaf and know where it came from without even looking at the sign. And the locket? He made it for his daughter. I was standing at the sink the day he gave it to her." Camille closed her eyes for a second. "My mother never told me." "I know. You worked here back then?" "I was washing dishes in this kitchen before your mother could walk." Camille opened her eyes. "Then why didn't you tell me anything for 5 years?" Ottilie didn't answer immediately. She walked over to the stool in the corner of the storeroom, sat down, then pulled something from the pocket of her apron wrapped inside a sheet of paper folded into quarters. She opened it and held it up. It was an old photograph, yellowed at the edges, taken in a kitchen Camille recognized at once because the brick oven in the background was still standing in exactly the same place today. There were 2 young women in the photograph, both wearing white aprons, their arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling at the camera. The woman on the left was her mother. Camille didn't need to look for long. She recognized the way her mother tilted her head when she smiled. The woman on the right was young too, her hair pinned high, one hand resting on her friend's shoulder. Camille looked at that face, then looked again, and her hands began to tremble. "No," she said. "It's her," Ottilie said. "No, look closely." Camille took the photograph. She held it closer to the light. There was nothing to mistake. The woman who was standing upstairs in this building at that very moment. The woman who had poured an entire pitcher of water over Camille's head in front of half the street. The woman who still told the neighborhood council that she had taken in a girl who had no one left in the world, was smiling in this photograph, with one arm around Camille's mother. What was she doing here? Accounting. Your grandfather hired her. For how long? Years. She and my mother were inseparable, Ottilie said. Those 2 grew up in this kitchen. No one could pull them apart. Camille set the photograph down on the shelf, because she couldn't hold it steady anymore, so she didn't take me in out of nowhere. No, she knew who I was. She knew who you were before you could speak. Camille leaned fully against the shelving unit. Inside her mind, the past 5 years were rearranging themselves into a different shape, and that shape made her feel cold. "What happened?" she asked. "Between my mother and my grandfather." Ottilie looked down at her hands. "There was an envelope," she said. "She gave it to me. I carried it upstairs and handed it to Ilario. I didn't open it. I had no reason to. I had carried papers up to him 100 times before." She stopped for a very long time. He read it, stood up, went downstairs, and said things to his daughter that no father should ever say. That autumn, Rosalie took her daughter and left her father's building, and she never came back. Camille couldn't speak. "You asked why I didn't tell you for 5 years. Ottilie looked up. "I've stood at that sink all these years not because I needed the job, sweetheart. I've stayed there because I was the one who carried that envelope." A few blocks away, in an empty parking lot behind an old warehouse on Eagle Street, Aurelio Santoro leaned against the front bumper of his car and looked out toward the road. It was still daylight. The wind carried the smell of paint from the workshop next door. Gideon Marsh arrived 10 minutes late, and he apologized for it the moment he stepped out of his car. The kind of apology made by a man accustomed to having other people wait for him. He walked over and stood beside Aurelio, also facing the road, the 2 of them looking in the same direction the way they had stood together for so many years. "You called in a hurry," Gideon said. "Is something wrong?" 219 Atwells. Gideon didn't answer immediately. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes, then slipped it back into his pocket. "The restaurant. The building. Fine. The building. What about it? You signed the transfer papers. You already knew that. Back then, your father told me to sign. So I signed. I didn't read them. I signed hundreds of things like that." Aurelio kept looking toward the road. "You signed 3 times. Gideon turned toward him. 3 times? The first was when I was still in school. The second was a few years later. Aurelio paused. The third was 4 years ago. The wind swept across the parking lot, sending a scrap of paper rolling over the concrete. "I don't remember," Gideon said. "You remember, Aurelio. There's a girl in that building. She sleeps in a small room on the 3rd floor, right beside the foot of the stairs leading up to the office. You had to walk past that door to reach the desk where you signed." Aurelio said it in the voice of a man reciting yesterday's weather. "Did you see that door?" Gideon remained silent. "Did you know whose daughter she was?" "I didn't know. Did you ask?" There was no answer. A truck passed the entrance to the lot, shifted gears, and the sound of its engine slowly faded into the distance. "I don't blame you for the first time," Aurelio said. "I was 13 then. You were doing what my father told you to do. I understand that. I don't blame you for the second time either." He pushed himself upright from the bumper. "But the 3rd time, you had already walked past that door." Gideon turned fully toward him. "I've worked for your family my whole life. I know. I taught you to drive your first car. You weren't even tall enough to see over the steering wheel. I had to put 2 phone books under the seat. I know. So what are you going to do?" "Go home, Uncle." Gideon stood there with his arms hanging at his sides. In that moment, it was easy to see that he was waiting for something else. Some correction, some sentence saying that it was over now, that the past was the past. "I raised you since you were." "I know." Aurelio opened the car door. "That's why I'm letting you walk home on your own." He sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. He didn't slam it. He closed it very gently, and it was that gentleness that finally made the man standing outside understand what had just happened to him. The car backed out, turned, reached the road, and disappeared into the afternoon traffic. Gideon Marsh remained exactly where he was in the middle of the empty concrete lot. His own car was parked a little more than 10 steps away, the keys still in his pocket, and he could easily have walked over, opened the door, and driven home. But he didn't move. He simply stood there, a man already past 60, alone in a parking lot with no one else around, knowing that from that afternoon onward, there would be no more phone calls. No one hit him. No one said a cruel word to him. Someone had simply closed a car door very softly, and that was the end. On Tuesday morning, Delia came down to the kitchen before 7 o'clock, and she brought 2 people with her, Brantley and the new kitchen assistant, who had only been working there for a few months. Camille was standing at the work table. Ottilie was at the sink. 2 other people were in the kitchen putting supplies into the refrigerator. "Everyone stop what you're doing," Delia said. She didn't raise her voice. "The health department is coming next week for an inspection. They have a new rule about personal items in food preparation areas. Starting today, no one is allowed to wear jewelry, watches, necklaces, or rings in the kitchen. No exceptions." No one said anything. The kitchen assistant and Brantley moved to the open space in front of the doorway leading into the hall, not blocking it completely, just standing there, 2 men and 1 door. That didn't need any explanation either. Camille understood exactly what it meant in a single second. Delia walked around the kitchen. She told the 2 people stocking the refrigerator to remove their watches, and they did. She looked at Ottilie's hands, saw nothing there, and moved on. Then she stopped in front of Camille. "You too." Camille didn't move. "The necklace." Ottilie looked up from the sink. She didn't say anything, but the water in the basin had stopped moving. And in this kitchen, that was a way of speaking too. "I've worn it for 5 years, Camille said. "I've never let it fall into any food. Rules are rules. I keep it under my shirt." "Take it off." Camille looked toward the door. The 2 men were still standing there. Brantley wouldn't look at her. He stared at the floor, shifted 1 foot slightly, then stood still again. The kitchen assistant looked straight ahead, his expression empty in the way of someone simply carrying out an assignment. Camille calculated very quickly. She could say no. Then what? Then they would stand there until she said yes. Then someone would come around the work table. Then someone else's hands would touch her neck. And that moment would be what she carried for the rest of her life, not the chain itself. Camille raised both hands behind her neck. She opened the clasp. She did it slowly, without rushing at all, and no one in the kitchen moved while she was doing it. She drew the chain out from beneath her collar. The copper locket rested neatly in her palm, warm from her skin. She wrapped the chain around it 3 times, carefully, the way someone puts away something they intend to take back. Then she opened her hand and placed it into Delia's waiting palm. She placed it there. No one snatched it from her. Delia closed her fingers around it. She looked down at it for a moment. "Just a few old coins," she said. Camille didn't answer. She looked directly into the woman's face, and she held that gaze a little longer than necessary, long enough that Delia was the one who looked away first. She slipped the locket into her coat pocket, turned, and walked out. The 2 men at the door stepped aside to let her pass, then followed her. Half an hour later, Camille carried a tray of pastries upstairs to the dining room, and as she passed the office door, she saw through the narrow opening the steel safe in the corner, and Delia's hand closing its door. There was the sound of the locking mechanism turning, dry and precise. Camille kept walking. She set down the tray, returned to the kitchen, washed her hands under the faucet, and completed the rest of the morning shift exactly as she did every day. Ottilie didn't ask her a single question. That evening, when Camille went up to the small room on the 3rd floor, she sat on the edge of the bed and raised a hand to her neck out of habit. There was nothing there, only a strip of skin slightly paler than the rest, thin as a thread, lying exactly where the chain had rested for 5 years. She pressed 2 fingers to that pale mark and held them there for a very long time in the darkness. She could leave that very night. She thought about it again, but the safe was still in the upstairs office, and now there was one more thing inside it that belonged to her. It began on Thursday, and at first it was so small that no one thought of it as anything at all. The truck carrying clean linens didn't arrive. The person answering the phone at the laundry company said the truck had broken down and would come the next day. It didn't. By Saturday evening, with every table occupied, the dining room had run out of tablecloths, and Brantley had to rush downstairs to the kitchen and use kitchen cloths on the last 2 tables. On Sunday morning, the waste collection company sent a notice terminating its contract without giving a reason, signed by a man Delia had shaken hands with at the neighborhood party the year before. By Monday, 3 suppliers somehow ran out of stock on the same day. There was no fish. There was no flour. As for the wine, they said the warehouse was conducting an inventory. A property developer named Corbin Whitaker had been buying up the block, waiting for the restaurant to fail. Delia sat in the upstairs office, making calls from morning until noon. She called each person in the voice she always used with the neighborhood council, then in another voice, then in another one after that. The people who answered said they were busy and would call her back. No one called back. In this neighborhood, people never told anyone no. They were simply busy. By Tuesday evening, she stopped calling. She sat in the narrow upstairs office with the phone lying face down on the desk, while Brantley stood in the doorway asking his mother what was happening. And for the first time in his life, he watched her refuse to answer a question. Before dawn on Wednesday, Camille woke to the smell of smoke. She sat bolt upright in the darkness. No alarm was sounding. She opened her door, and smoke had already reached the third-floor landing, thin and gray, crawling along the ceiling. She ran downstairs. At the foot of the stairs, the smoke was thicker, and from behind the secondary kitchen came a steady crackling sound, the sound of dry wood catching fire. Ottilie had stayed overnight on the couch in the changing room, something she often did when the late shift ended too late. Camille shook her awake and pulled her into the hallway. The emergency exit was at the far end. She pushed it. It didn't move. She drove her shoulder into it a second time, and the door opened only as wide as her hand before stopping hard. And through the gap she saw a 20-liter container of cooking oil wedged across the outside. There was no way to move it from inside. Camille turned around. She pulled Ottilie back toward the storeroom, toward the wall where a large ventilation duct opened into the rear alley. She dragged the shelving unit away from the wall, climbed onto it, and struck the vent cover with her elbow, then her shoulder. Then with a cast-iron pan she yanked down from a hook. 3 times, 4 times. The cover broke loose. She pushed Ottilie through first, helped lower her down on the other side, then climbed through after her. The air in the alley was so cold and clean that Camille doubled over coughing. Ottilie dropped onto the wet concrete, gasping for breath, one hand gripping the leg of Camille's pants. Somewhere near the end of the street, sirens had already begun to sound. Camille stood up. "I'm going back inside." Ottilie grabbed her. "No, the notebook." "Camille, it's hanging beside the oven." Camille pulled Ottilie's hand away, took off her outer coat, soaked it in a puddle beside the wall, wrapped it around her face, then crawled back through the ventilation opening. Inside, the smoke had grown so thick that she had to move by memory. 5 years in that kitchen meant she could. Sink on the left, 3 steps. Work table on the right, 5 steps. Oven corner at the far end. The notebook hung from a nail beside the oven door, its leather cover worn smooth, the binding cord broken once and repaired with thread. She tore it down, pressed it against her chest, and retraced her way out. By the time she crawled through the vent for the second time, fire engines had reached the mouth of the alley. Someone draped a blanket around her shoulders. Someone else wrapped a wet cloth around her left hand. She was still holding the notebook. The fire was extinguished in about an hour. It consumed the secondary kitchen and the storeroom behind it, blackened a section of the dividing wall, and stopped there. The main dining room was untouched. No one had to be taken to the hospital. By morning, after the hoses had been pulled away and every door had been thrown open to let the smoke escape, Delia entered through the front. She walked through the undamaged dining room, through the connecting door, and stopped in the middle of the blackened secondary kitchen. She stood there for a very long time, her shoes submerged in water, and she didn't look at the oven, didn't look at the wall, didn't look at the emergency exit at the end of the corridor. Then she took out her phone and dialed a number. She raised it to her ear. It rang, 1 full ring cycle, then another, then voicemail. She dialed again. It rang. No one answered. Camille stood at the rear alley entrance with the notebook still in her hands and watched everything. She watched the woman lower the phone very slowly, look down at the screen, then raise her eyes toward the fire-blackened wall in front of her. And there was no anger on Delia's face at all. There was only something Camille had never seen there in 5 years. Delia Prescott had just realized that she wasn't the person who decided what happened inside this building. She had never been that person. The fire trucks left just as dawn began to break. The hoses were rolled up, the barricades at the mouth of the alley were taken away, and the street was given back its silence, leaving only puddles scattered across the concrete and the smell of wet smoke clinging to everything. Camille sat down on the step outside the back door. The blanket was still around her shoulders, the notebook resting on her lap, both hands placed over it. She hadn't opened it once since getting it back. She simply sat there and breathed. A car stopped at the end of the alley. She didn't turn around. She heard the car door close, then footsteps coming toward her, unhurried, and the splash of water as the person stepped through the first puddle. He didn't go around it. He walked straight through, his leather shoes sinking into water up to the ankles, and he didn't look down at them once. He stopped in front of the step, then sat beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long time. From inside the secondary kitchen came the steady sound of water dripping onto the floor. "You went back in a second time." He said it as a statement, not a question. Camille looked down at the notebook. "It belonged to my grandfather." He said nothing more. He looked at the notebook too, at the worn leather cover, the binding cord repaired with thread, the corner of the pages swollen from the water. "The emergency exit was blocked from the outside," she said. "I know. How do you know?" "I walked around and checked it before I came in here." Camille turned to look at him. There was a dark line of water along the hem of his trousers. "Whoever did this, I'll find them," he said. "And then what?" He was silent long enough for her to understand that he was weighing his answer, not searching for one. "Then they'll answer in court," he said. "Not to me." She looked at him for another moment, then turned away. From where they sat, they could see a narrow strip of sky between the two buildings, and it was beginning to turn the pale gray of early morning. "You don't seem like the kind of man who says that," she said. "I'm not." "Then why did you?" "Because I promised someone I'd do it this way." Camille waited. He didn't continue. She pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders. The firefighter's blanket was thin and damp at one corner, and now that the panic had begun to drain away, she was finally starting to feel the cold, a slow chill rising from the wet concrete beneath her. He noticed. He didn't ask. He took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders, on top of the blanket. Camille didn't thank him. She didn't give it back either. She simply drew the two sides together across her chest with her uninjured hand, and the two of them sat there in silence, looking toward that narrow strip of sky between the walls. Neither of them mentioned the coat. Neither of them mentioned that this was the second time. After a while, he stood up. "Keep that notebook safe." That was all he said before walking back toward the end of the alley. Camille remained on the step with his coat around her shoulders and the notebook on her lap, and it wasn't until the sound of his car had completely disappeared that she realized something. All morning, he had been the only person who had asked her anything about what she had done inside the fire, instead of asking when the restaurant would be able to open again. The restaurant closed for repairs. Tarps were stretched across the secondary kitchen. Scaffolding went up in the alley, and the main dining room only needed the walls cleaned. Delia went to Boston for 2 days to meet with the insurance company. On Friday afternoon, when only Camille, Ottilie, and 2 workers removing the last sheet of plywood remained in the building, Brantley Prescott went upstairs. Camille was carrying a stack of towels through the hallway when she saw the office door standing open. He was in front of the safe in the corner with one hand on the dial, and he turned to look at her. "Come in," he said. "Close the door." Camille didn't move. "Come in." She set the stack of towels down on the hallway floor and stepped inside. She didn't close the door all the way. She left it open about the width of a hand, and he noticed but said nothing. He turned the dial. 3 turns. Stop. 2 turns back. Stop. There was the sound of gears catching, and the safe door released. "What are you doing?" Camille asked. Brantley didn't answer. He reached inside and took out a large envelope. He opened it, checked what was inside, then held it out to her. "Yours." Camille took it. Her birth certificate, her driver's license, her social security card, even the bank card she had opened when she was still in school, expired long ago. Her hands began to shake, and she pressed the envelope against her chest to keep it from slipping. He reached into the safe a second time. The copper locket, the chain still wrapped 3 times around it exactly the way she had wound it that day. He placed it on the desk and pushed it toward her. Then he turned, pulled a chair over to the high shelf, climbed up, and brought down a cardboard box sealed with tape that had yellowed along the edges. He placed it on the floor between them. Camille stared at the box. It had been sitting on that shelf for 5 years. She had walked past it no fewer than 1,000 times. "It belonged to your mother," Brantley said. She didn't bend down. She looked at him. "Why?" "Take it and leave." I asked why. He straightened and wiped his hands on his pants. His face had gone pale, and it wasn't from the dust. "The emergency exit," he said. "It was blocked from the outside. The fire department already put it in the report." "I know. I was standing on the inside of it." "Do you know whose name is listed as the person responsible for managing this building?" He pointed at his own chest. "Mine. The business license, the fire safety documents, the personnel records. Every one of them has my signature on it. Not my mother's." Camille remained silent. "I called her that night," Brantley said. 3 o'clock in the morning. I said, "Mom, there's a fire." Do you know what she asked me? He stopped. She asked whether the main dining room was all right. Camille stood perfectly still. "She didn't ask whether anyone was inside," he said. "She didn't ask that." He nudged the box a little closer to her with the toe of his shoe. "I'm not doing this for you," he said, and his voice was so clear then that it was almost unpleasant. "Don't misunderstand me. If anyone ever starts asking questions about this safe, I don't want someone else's documents inside it. I don't want this box inside it. He closed the safe door and turned the dial back to its original position. Take everything, right now. Camille bent down and lifted the box into her arms. It was lighter than she had expected. She tucked the envelope beneath one arm, held the locket in her palm, and stood. If anyone asks later, Brantley said, you say you took it yourself. I was never standing here. She stepped into the hallway. Ottilie was standing at the top of the stairs with a broom in her hand. She saw the cardboard box in Camille's arms. She saw the office door closing behind her. She saw everything. Then she turned and went downstairs. And the sound of the broom sweeping across the wooden steps resumed in the same steady rhythm it had kept for all those years. Delia returned the following afternoon. She went upstairs to the office, opened the safe, and stood looking into it for a very long time. She called Brantley upstairs. He said he hadn't been inside that room since she left for Boston. She took out her phone, pressed 3 numbers, and stopped with her finger resting over the call button. She stood that way for a while. Then she turned off the screen, placed the phone face down on the desk, and never said another word to anyone about the safe. Camille carried the box up to the small room on the 3rd floor and set it down in the middle of the floor. She sat in front of it. She didn't open it right away. She remained there long enough for the light outside the window to turn from gray to complete darkness. Then she switched on the desk lamp, pulled the box closer, and peeled away the brittle tape with her fingertips. The first thing inside was an apron. The white cotton had yellowed to ivory, the 2 ties still holding an old knot at one end, and along the lower hem was a small, crescent-shaped burn mark, the trace of one moment when the fabric had brushed against the side of an oven. Camille picked it up. She raised it to her face. After so many years, every familiar scent was gone, leaving only the smell of cardboard and dust. She folded it along its old creases and placed it beside her. The second thing was a round tin baking pan, rusted around the rim, one corner bent as though it had once been dropped. She rested it on her lap and turned it gently. On the inside of the bottom, faded but still recognizable, was an embossed bundle of wheat inside a circle. She set the pan on the floor beside the apron. The third thing was at the very bottom, leaning against the side of the box, a pale yellow envelope, unsealed, with a handwritten line across the front that she recognized from 3 feet away. For my daughter, when she is old enough to ask. Camille didn't open it for a length of time that could have been counted. She placed both hands on her thighs and sat perfectly still. Then she picked up the envelope, drew out the sheet of paper inside, and spread it across her knees beneath the lamp. My child, I'm sorry I stayed silent for so long. I kept thinking I still had time to tell you everything from the beginning, and I was wrong. The building at 219 Atwells Avenue belonged to your grandfather. It belongs to you. Don't let anyone tell you that you have nothing. I didn't have enough time to get it back for you. But there was once a little boy who used to sit on the step behind our building. If you ever meet him, tell him I never forgot. The final line had been written in different ink, paler than the rest, and the handwriting shook so badly that the last word was almost impossible to read. Camille read the entire letter once. Then she read it again from the beginning. Then she folded the paper along its old creases, slipped it back into the envelope, and placed the envelope on the floor beside the apron. She stood up. She walked to the window and remained there, staring at the brick wall of the building next door for long enough that her breathing returned to normal. Then she turned and sat down again. There was one more thing inside the envelope. She had felt it when she pulled out the letter but hadn't taken it out at the same time. Now she did. It was 2 sheets of lined paper, yellowed with age, folded into thirds, covered completely in handwriting that was entirely different, the handwriting of an old man who wrote slowly and pressed the pen hard into the paper. A date was written at the top of the first page. Beneath it were lines about the building at 219 Atwells Avenue, about how it was to belong to his daughter, and if his daughter was no longer alive, then it was to belong to his daughter's child. At the bottom of the second page was his signature. Beneath that signature were 2 lines for witnesses. The first was clearly signed, the full name written by hand, the ink still dark. The second held only a faint trace, the ink almost completely faded, enough only to show that a name had once been there. Camille held the paper close to the lamp. She tilted it. She changed the angle. The faint mark remained only a faint mark. She sat in the middle of the floor with the apron, the baking pan, the letter, and the 2 sheets of lined paper arranged in a row before her. Outside, the street had gone quiet. She raised a hand to her neck out of habit, and this time the locket was there. She had put it back on in the hallway that afternoon, and the metal had already warmed against her skin. She placed 2 fingers over it and held them there. He called her on Monday afternoon and asked her to meet him at the little cafe at the end of the street, the one with only 4 tables pressed close to the front window. Camille brought the envelope with her. She had intended to show it to him. She hadn't even had time to place it on the table before he spoke. "Your father is still alive." Camille was pulling out her chair. She stopped in that position. "What did you say?" "Sit down." She sat. One hand still held the edge of the table. "I don't have a father," she said. "My mother never mentioned him. Not once. His name is Emile Teixeira." He placed his phone face down on the table. "He's serving a sentence at a federal correctional facility in this state. He has a few months left." Camille couldn't say anything. A server approached. Aurelio raised one hand, and the server stepped away. "My father had a network of companies," Aurelio said. "A lot of companies. A lot of names signing papers. When it collapsed, someone had to take all of it. Emile Teixeira was the man who signed for it." "Why him?" "Because he volunteered." Aurelio looked through the window. "He had only one condition. My family wasn't to touch his wife or child. No searching for them, no questions, no going near them." My father agreed. Camille lowered her eyes to her hands resting on the tabletop. She could see them trembling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Inside her mind, something she had sealed away a very long time ago was opening far too quickly. Her mother had never spoken about that man. There were no photographs, no name, not a single sentence. Camille had grown up believing he had simply walked away. "Does he know I exist?" she asked. "Yes." "Does he know my mother is dead?" "I haven't asked him that yet." Camille raised a hand to her mouth. She sat that way for a while, and during that silence something warm began to rise inside her chest. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in many years. A few months. She could wait a few months. She had waited far longer than that many times in her life. "I didn't know," Aurelio said. "Not until yesterday." She looked up. There was something in his voice that made her look up. "I hired a lawyer," he said. "Meredith Locke. I told her to trace the sale of the building, who sold it, who bought it, where the money came from." From that point on, he spoke more slowly. "The Prescotts didn't buy that building, Camille." "What?" "They didn't have that kind of money. They never did." He placed both hands on the table. "A company loaned them the entire amount. A company with no office, no employees, nothing but a name on paper." "Whose company?" He didn't avoid the question. He didn't stretch the answer out for even a second. "My father's." Camille didn't move. "They borrowed the money to buy it," he said. "In return, that restaurant moved money through his network for 25 years. And for the last 5, while you were downstairs washing dishes, outside the window, someone walked past laughing, and then the sound disappeared. The name on the loan records is Emile Teixeira," he said. "That's why I only found out who your father was yesterday." Camille looked down at the pale yellow envelope she had placed on the table. She had brought it there to give to him. Inside was the letter her mother had written, including the line about the little boy who used to sit on the back step. She placed her palm over the envelope and pulled it back toward herself. "How long have you known about this?" "Since last night." "You could have kept quiet." He didn't answer that. "You could walk out of this cafe and never say another word to me," Camille said. "I would never know. No one would know." "That's right. Then why did you tell me?" He looked directly at her. "I came here because of your mother," he said. "I owe her 2 years on that back step. I came to repay that." He paused. "But the family that took everything from you was mine." Camille stood up. Her chair scraped sharply across the tile. The server behind the counter looked up, then immediately lowered their eyes again. "Get out," she said. He didn't explain himself. He didn't say another word about the fact that he had only been 13 at the time, that he hadn't signed anything, that he had spent money tracing every line of the financial trail. He stood, left cash beneath the saucer, and walked to the door. The cafe door closed very softly behind him. Camille remained alone among the 4 empty tables, one hand still resting on the envelope, and inside her chest, the warmth that had begun to rise only minutes earlier had gone completely cold. 3 days later, someone delivered a stiff envelope directly into Camille's hands, and the courier waited at the back door until she signed for it. Inside was a check and a complete set of documents already prepared, missing only her signature, transferring ownership of the building at 219 Atwells Avenue into the name of Camille Marchetti. There was no letter enclosed, not a single line. Camille carried the entire packet up to the small room on the 3rd floor and placed it on the bed. She looked at it all evening. She didn't read the amount written on the check. She only looked at the empty place, waiting for her signature. And she thought about the last time she had signed a piece of paper someone else placed in front of her, 3 days after her mother's funeral, in a narrow upstairs room inside this very building. The next morning, she tore a sheet from the kitchen order notebook, wrote one line, folded it, placed it in an envelope with the check and the untouched documents, and handed it back to the courier when he returned. I won't sell my mother a second time. In the right margin, written smaller and squeezed into the remaining space on the page, there was one more line, the loaf on the back step. Do you remember which recipe my mother used to make it? He didn't answer. There was no letter, no phone call. No one came to the back door again. But he didn't throw that scrap of paper away. It stayed in the drawer of his desk beneath a stack of files. And over the weeks that followed, he opened that drawer more often than he needed to. Camille moved out at the end of the week. She didn't tell anyone. She packed her things into 2 bags, took the cardboard box, her grandfather's notebook, and the pale yellow envelope. She went down the stairs while it was still dark, passed through the kitchen that was only halfway repaired, and Ottilie was standing at the sink as she was every morning. She didn't ask where Camille was going. She only dried her hands on her apron, walked over, placed one damp palm against Camille's cheek for a moment, then returned to her place. Camille left through the back door. She didn't slam it. No one chased her. No one blocked the exit. She simply walked out. And this time she walked out because she had decided to. She rented a small room a few blocks away, above a laundromat, with a window overlooking a corrugated metal roof. She applied for work at the bakery at the beginning of the avenue, the one that opened at 5 o'clock in the morning and sold bread and coffee to construction workers. The owner asked whether she had identification. She showed him. He asked what she could do. She needed a batch of dough right there in front of him. He hired her that same day. Every morning she walked to the bakery, and the route from her room to the shop took her past 219 Atwells Avenue. She passed it every day. She never looked at it once. Around the same time, in a law office downtown, Meredith Locke spread the entire file across a long table and told her client that if she submitted all of it to probate court, it wouldn't only reopen the sale from all those years ago. His father's entire network of companies would be opened with it. She explained exactly what that meant. One account at a time, one property at a time, and it took her nearly an hour to finish. Aurelio listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt once. File everything, he said when she stopped. You understand what you're going to lose, don't you? My father built this with money taken from other people. He stood and fastened the button on his jacket. I don't want to stand on it anymore. He signed away every interest he held in the building, at 219 Atwells Avenue, and in several other properties in the neighborhood that had once been held under the shell company's name. He opened the old books completely to the court. He did it without telling anyone beforehand. The following week, 3 men he had done business with for years called him, each of them once, and all 3 conversations were very short. After that, they didn't call again. By the end of the month, people in Federal Hill had begun saying to one another that Aurelio Santoro was tearing apart with his own hands the things his father had left behind, and no one understood why. One person would have understood, but she was standing in another kitchen a few blocks away, kneading dough from 5 o'clock in the morning, and she had no idea any of it was happening. Camille filled out the visitation application one evening after her shift, mailed it, and waited. The reply arrived 10 days later, and inside was a date, a time, and a long string of numbers she had to read twice before she copied them correctly onto a scrap of paper. That morning, she went to work as usual, finished her shift, changed clothes, took the bus, and arrived well before the appointed time. They led her into a row of booths divided by glass, pointed to the 4th chair from the entrance, and she sat down with both hands resting on her thighs. The door on the other side opened. The man who walked in had completely white hair, and he moved a little slowly on his left leg. He sat down in the chair across from her, placed both hands on the narrow ledge in front of the glass, and looked at her. He didn't say anything. He simply sat there looking at her, and enough time passed that Camille began to wonder whether they had brought the wrong man. Then she saw him swallow. You're like your mother in one way. You don't cry in front of strangers, he said. His voice was rough, like the voice of a man who hadn't spoken much in a very long time. You're not a stranger. He lowered his head. His hands on the ledge closed, then opened again. I'm sorry, he said. I practiced my first sentence so many times, but now that you're sitting here, I've forgotten all of it. Camille didn't know what to say. How long have you known I was still alive? Only recently. Who told you? She hesitated. Aurelio Santoro. He nodded slowly, without looking surprised. I've known him since he was a little boy, he said. He's not like his father. Camille placed both hands on the ledge on her side of the glass. Did you know Mom died? I knew, he said. I knew before you had even finished arranging the funeral. Her head snapped up. How? Ottilie Nunes. Camille's whole body went rigid. She's been writing to me all these years, he said. 1 letter every month, sometimes 2. She told me what you were doing, whether you were well, whether you were eating properly. She writes in very large letters. They're easy for me to read." He paused. "She even told me about the day they poured water over you in the street." For several seconds, Camille couldn't breathe. Then why didn't she tell me? She knew everything. She knew who that building belonged to. She knew who my mother was. For 5 years, she didn't say a single word. He looked directly at her. "Because I told her not to." Camille sat still. "Don't blame her," he said. "Blame me." "Why?" "Because I was afraid." He drew his hands closer to himself. "I knew you were your mother's daughter. I knew that if you heard even one word about that building, you would go after it. You would go after it all the way. You wouldn't stop, no matter who was standing on the other side." He spoke more slowly. "I've been sitting in here for years. I know what it costs to stand up and claim something when you have nothing in your hands. I didn't want you to lose your years the way I lost mine." Camille lowered her eyes. "I was wrong," he said. "I kept thinking that if I kept you from knowing anything, I was keeping you safe. But they made you wash dishes in your own grandfather's kitchen for 5 years, while I sat here reading letters and telling myself I was protecting you." She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, then lowered it again. "I want to ask you something." "Ask." "Why did you take all of it? You didn't do those things." He didn't answer immediately. He looked past her shoulder toward the wall behind her for a very long time. "Because when they came for me, your mother was pregnant with you," he said. "And she had no one else left in the world but me." He said nothing more about himself. He didn't tell her what he had lost, what he had thought, or how long he had wrestled with the decision. He said only that one sentence and stopped. Camille sat in silence. Somewhere beyond the glass booths, someone called out a number. "You only have a few months left," she said. "Yes, I'll come get you." He nodded. Then he lifted his right hand and pressed his palm against the glass between them. Camille looked at that hand. She raised her left hand, the one with the old scar across the back and the newer mark that still hadn't fully healed, and placed it against the exact same spot on her side of the glass. Meredith Locke called her on a Thursday afternoon and asked her to come to the office. Camille arrived in her work clothes, with flour still caught beneath her fingernails. The lawyer placed a thin file in front of her, nowhere near as thick as Camille had expected. "I traced your mother's treatment records," she said. "The hospital kept everything. Look at the last column." Camille pulled the file closer. In the final column on every page was the name of the party responsible for payment, and the same name appeared from the first page to the last. "An insurance company. Your mother had insurance through her former employer," Meredith said. "The policy remained active through the end of her treatment. The remaining copay balance was cleared by the hospital's patient assistance fund at the end of that year. I have the debt forgiveness confirmation right here." She turned to the next page. There were no payments made by any private individual. Not a single one. Camille read that last column again. She started at the first page and went through it line by line until she reached the last. Then she read it all a second time. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Camille set the papers down on the desk. She sat there in silence for a very long time, and then something inside her chest broke open without warning, without noise, and she covered her face with both hands and cried. She cried like someone who had carried something unbearably heavy on her shoulders for a very long distance, only to be told at the end that the burden had never belonged to her in the first place. 5 years. 5 years of lowering her head in that kitchen. 5 years of telling herself she owed a debt, and all of it had been built on a single sentence spoken once and never mentioned again. Meredith pushed the tissue box across the desk and said nothing. Camille wiped her face. She drew in a breath, let it out, then sat up straight. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Your grandfather's handwritten will," Meredith said. "That's the key. But the other side's lawyer is going to attack its weakest point. And the weakest point is the second witness signature. It's faded so badly that no one can read it. If we can only verify one witness, the court could still reject it." "Who was the first witness?" "Salvatore Bruno. He's 88 years old and belongs to the Neighborhood Mutual Aid Society. I've already met with him. He remembers everything very clearly." Meredith tapped one finger against the document. "The problem is the second witness. We have to find that person. And I have absolutely nothing to start with." Camille returned to her room that evening and took her grandfather's notebook from the cloth bag. She had never read it from beginning to end. She turned through the pages beneath the desk lamp. Old graph paper yellowed with age, crowded with recipes written in heavy, deliberate strokes, with small notes scattered between them, the kind of things a man had written about the life of his bakery in the same place where he recorded flour ratios. "Faro family wedding cake. Add orange peel. Mr. Pina's memorial. Make 6 loaves." She reached somewhere in the 30s and stopped. "Bread for the Delgado baby's baptism. No sugar." Camille read the line 3 times. Something in her mind gave a quiet knock. She closed her eyes and tried to remember. Oddly, one afternoon long ago, stacking plates onto the rack and speaking absent-mindedly the way she often did when no one was expected to answer, saying that in the old days the bakery had regular customers who came for decades, including a woman who worked as a notary down the street, who stopped in every week to buy bread and would sit talking with the owner for an hour. Ottilie hadn't mentioned a name. Camille opened her eyes. The next morning, during her break, she called 3 places, and at the 4th, someone told her yes. There had been a woman by that name. She had retired many years ago, and she was now living in a nursing home a few blocks from Atwell's Avenue. Camille returned to the bakery, asked the owner if she could use the oven before the afternoon shift, and baked a small batch using the recipe from the notebook. She wrapped 1 loaf in a cloth while it was still warm and walked there. Someone led her into a common room with large windows. The elderly woman was sitting in an armchair near one of them, her eyes closed, both hands resting on the blanket across her lap. Camille sat in the chair opposite her and placed the still-wrapped loaf on the small table between them. Warmth rose through the fabric. The woman drew in a breath. Then she opened her eyes. She didn't look at the bread. She looked straight at Camille. "You're Rosalie's daughter," she said. The meeting took place in the private dining room at Prescott's on an afternoon when the restaurant was closed, and Aurelio was the one who chose the location. Corbin Whitaker arrived with his lawyer. Delia was already seated at the head of the table. Aurelio placed 3 folders on the tabletop side by side, none thicker than the others. He pushed the first toward Whitaker. "The files on your project along this block. They include the fire scene report and the statement from the night shift supervisor about the emergency exit." He pushed the second folder toward Delia. "The restaurant's personnel records for the past 5 years. No contracts, no wages, no reporting." Whitaker's lawyer reached for the first folder. Aurelio didn't stop him. Then Aurelio placed one hand on the third folder and drew it back toward himself. "This one is mine," he said. "Every set of books from my father's companies. From the very first day." Whitaker looked up. "What are you saying?" "They all get filed at the same time." For a while, no one in the room said anything. "You'll lose everything," Whitaker said. "I know. Are you threatening me?" Aurelio looked at him. "I never threaten anyone. A threat is something you have to say twice." Whitaker remained seated a little longer. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without touching the folder on the table. His lawyer followed him. The dining room door closed, leaving Delia Prescott alone at the head of the long table, with 2 stacks of papers in front of her, and no one left to call. The Neighborhood Appreciation Gala was held the following Saturday evening in the hall on Knight Street, where enough round tables had been arranged to seat 200 people. Delia sat at the front table. The host was reading the introduction, words about a woman who had opened her arms to someone who had no one left in the world, and the entire room was applauding when the doors at the back of the hall opened. Camille walked in alone. She was still wearing her kitchen clothes, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she walked straight between the rows of tables toward the front. She didn't go to the stage. She stopped in front of Salvatore Bruno, placed a pale yellow envelope and 2 sheets of lined paper folded into thirds on the table before him. Then she removed the chain from around her neck and set the locket beside them. She didn't say a word. Delia shot to her feet. "That belongs to me." She pointed at the locket. "It was inside my safe." The sentence fell into a hall that had gone completely silent. No one answered. No one asked why, but 200 people had just heard the same thing, and Delia understood what she had done the instant the words left her mouth. She stood there with one hand still half raised, then slowly lowered it. Bruno picked up the locket. He looked at it for a very long time without speaking, then placed it back on the table in front of him. He reached for the envelope, took out the letter, and began to read aloud. He read slowly, in the voice of an 88-year-old man reading before a crowd, and he read every word, including the final line written in different ink. Somewhere in the hall, a chair shifted. Someone raised a hand to their mouth. Bruno set the letter down and unfolded the 2 sheets of lined paper. He glanced over the first page, turned to the second, and stopped at the bottom. He took his glasses from his pocket, put them on, and tilted the paper toward the chandelier hanging in the center of the room. "The first signature is mine," he said. He tilted the paper a little farther. He remained like that for a very long time. Then he raised his head and looked toward the front table. "The second signature," he said, "belongs to Eleanor Vance, the notary down the street." No one shouted. No one stood. The entire hall simply turned in one direction at once, and that was all that happened. Delia didn't move. The person seated to her left eased their chair backward slightly, very quietly, just enough to leave a space. Then the person on her right did the same. Meredith Locke rose from the second table. "This document doesn't give the building to her," she said, and her voice carried clearly enough for the entire room to hear. "It proves the sale that took place that year was fraudulent. The sale is voided, The building returns to the estate of Ilario Marchetti, and his only surviving heir is standing here in this room. Camille remained exactly where she was, both arms resting at her sides. She hadn't spoken a single word since walking through those doors, and she said nothing now. Brantley Prescott came one morning when Camille was alone in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway without stepping inside, both hands in the pockets of his coat. He remained there long enough for her to know that he had rehearsed what he was about to say. "I should have looked more carefully," he said. Camille wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes, you should have." He nodded once, then turned and walked away. That was the last time she ever saw him. The Prescott family moved out of the neighborhood that month. The state labor agency opened an investigation, and everything that followed took place in meeting rooms and on paper, without anyone needing to shout at anyone in the street. The next morning, Adelie Nunez was already sitting in her usual place in the kitchen when Camille arrived. She looked at her once, then nodded toward the corner of the room. The oven's still cold. Many things can be locked inside a safe. The truth isn't one of them. The old sign was found in a contractor's storage room farther down the street, wrapped in canvas, the lettering almost completely peeled away on one side. It was restored and hung from the same old iron hooks above the doorway, directly beneath the stone lintel carved with the bundle of wheat inside a circle. On opening day, Atwell's Avenue was more crowded than usual. Camille had been working since 4 o'clock in the morning. She kneaded the dough with her left hand, now marked by 2 scars, pressing down with the heel of her palm, folding, turning it a quarter turn, then pressing again, following the same rhythm her mother had taught her years earlier in a cramped rented kitchen. She divided the dough, rounded each portion, and arranged them on trays. And before putting them into the oven, she took the old brass stamp found in her grandfather's toolbox and pressed a bundle of wheat inside a circle onto the top of every loaf. By noon, the bakery was full. Camille was pulling a tray from the oven when she looked up and saw him. Aurelio stood at the far end of the room near the door, not coming any farther inside. He stood there as though he wasn't certain he had the right to enter the middle of that room. She set the tray down, wiped her hands, and she was the one who walked toward him. He handed her a glass of milk. She looked at it, then at him. "There's a debt," he said. "It's been 25 years. Today I'm paying it back." Camille took the glass of milk. She stood still for a moment, then turned back to the counter, cut a piece of pastry from the tray that had just come out of the oven, the anise pastry she made from her mother's recipe, and placed it in his hand. He held the pastry. He looked at it longer than an ordinary person would look at a piece of pastry. Then he ate it, the first bite after 25 years. He didn't say anything, and she didn't ask anything, and the two of them simply stood there together, amid the voices filling the bakery. Late that afternoon, after most of the customers had gone, Camille wrapped a still warm loaf in a cloth, walked to the back, and opened the door leading into the alley. She bent down and placed it on the concrete step with the chipped corner. She didn't leave a note. She didn't tell anyone who it was for. She simply set it there, stood looking at it for a while, then closed the door and went back inside to her work. There is one thing this story leaves with us, and it is very simple. Kindness that requires another person to remain indebted for the rest of their life is no longer kindness. It has become a contract. No one in this world has the right to place a value on you because of the food they gave you, the clothes they gave you, or the place they gave you to sleep. A person's dignity doesn't rest in someone else's hands, no matter how many documents that person may hold. And the kindness you offer a stranger today, no matter how small, may return 25 years later, knock on your door, and save an entire life belonging to someone whose face you never even knew. If today's story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about Camille's journey? And if you were in her place, what would you have chosen? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear what comes from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video excellent health, joyful days, and peace beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next story.